Hey guys, what's up? This is Nachos, and in this video we're going to be reviewing some footage that I played at 2550. It's a session I played recently, and it was kind of an interesting session. It was just one table, but we're playing with a recreational villain 1 here, and I've got 20-ish hands that we go through. Some of them are relatively small, but there were quite a few that were pretty interesting still. So here we open, and we have a texture where I think it makes sense to just bet range on. I would be playing around with my sizing a little bit and just bet larger when I have a stronger hand, because recreationals don't check raise often enough, and especially on a paired texture like this, I think people at recreationals are going to be under check raising quite significantly. Our hand can just go and bet small, and then we would be checking back the turn quite often, mostly I would say. On this particular turn it becomes relatively close. I think you can go either way. My ace high is not worth that much here, and we definitely, bluffing is definitely a reasonable strategy here. We need some bluffs. Recreationals don't necessarily overfold much versus the second barrel or the triple barrel, just a little bit. But either way, it's fine here. On the pair texture, ace high is still worth something, and so checking is reasonable as well. Both options are okay here. We check back, and then we get this bet sizing. If you look at the data, then one thing that you'll see is that once the recreational goes larger, like let's say between 80% and 100%, that bet size is significantly stronger than when they go 3/4. So to say I'm thrilled here, like not really, right? Like being not thrilled here is an understatement. Having said that, I split with all the aces. And there's still error in the recreationals range. Recreationals tend to overbluff, check, call, check, bet quite a bit. The data point that we face a pot size bet is not ideal, and is definitely lowering the EV. And we're definitely going to be losing the majority of the times here, but we need to win 31.3%. So if we win 35%, it's a profitable call, and we're definitely getting above the 32% here. So I end up calling here, and no surprise, my opponent has the best hand. It's a bit annoying, but what can you do? Here versus the same recreational, similar idea. I would be betting my entire range on this texture. Just with my hand, I'm just going to size up a little bit. We can see that he has, 12, 13 big blinds here. And so I don't actually need to go this big. I can just still go small. And it doesn't really matter because it's very easy to get stacks in when your opponent is playing 12 big blinds. And we get a fold here. So hindsight, I would go a bit smaller. Here, playing versus a rec in seat 7. On a low texture like this, I am going to go with a polar strategy of, let's say, 3/4. You could go 2/3. You could even go pot or slide over bet, and it wouldn't really matter. I'm going 3/4 here, and then this is one of the highest frequency bets, simply because of the fact that we have 2 overcards to the 9, meaning that we can, if we get called, like we can relatively often turn a hand that is going to value bet 3 streets, sometimes 2, but usually 3 streets, which is going to be very, very good for us. We have a backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, and we don't really have a meaningful branch in the game theory where we check back and win with our queen high. So a lot of reasons to be betting quite aggressively here, and that's what we do. I go with, what is this, 2/3, which is fine. I had some problems with the hotkeys, and so I just clicked 3 big blinds and was sort of there. This was an interesting one. I'm not at all a short stack player, so when I get a limp here, I have no idea what to do. I looked at the sim later, and this was fine versus a solver. It's just that the solver is checking, is calling kings pure, for instance, queens pure, jacks pure. Like, solver plays very unconventional for the regular cash player, I would say. And very unconventional compared to a recreational like this. So whether this makes sense, I have no idea. Like, I'm pretty sure that the recreational is not going to trap as often, which is good. Winning the pot here when it's 2 big blinds is pretty good as well, right? If we get a fold a couple of times, then we can put it in with significantly less equity. So it's hard to say whether this is profitable. Like, it's probably profitable, but if it's more profitable than check, that's I'm not sure. It's probably okay, but it's hard to convince myself one way or another when I don't really play 10 big blind poker and my opponent is just playing completely different from the solves. This was an interesting hand. So I open here versus a regular. I check, my opponent checks back. I'm going to check quite often on a texture like this. Although I'm going to have some bets for sure on 10, 9, 8. If it's lower and more connected like this, so I think something like 5, 6, 7, 6, 7, 8, checking your die ranges is fine. Here you're going to have like a reasonable amount of offsuited straights and stuff like that, so you definitely want to develop a betting range. My hand could go in a betting range, but I decided to check this time. And then on the turn, I've solved this one, and solvers are relatively flexible here on the turn, it turns out. So going with a block bet and check, bet 75 and check, and overbet and check all yielded similar EVs. Actually, like the bet 75, bet 40% and check and overbet and check were the same EV. So you can kind of do whatever. I wasn't too sure in game, and so I decided to just go polar and just go with basically a 10 or pocket jacks and better. And I go with 133, which is a reasonable strategy. If you open a sim, it's not going to be the preferred sizing, but it's sort of okay. And like I said, you're not losing too much EV. So as long as you're playing your strategy and you're playing the correct ranges that go with the sizings, then usually solvers are relatively flexible. I get a call, and then on the river here, I was like, okay, what do we do now? We river a straight, which is quite an interesting card, but because it also completes a flush, and it will be villain's most common flush because on the flop they're more betting with spades than they are with hearts. Hearts are checking back a bit more, and so when the backdoor hearts come in, this becomes now their most likely flush because, like I said, like the spades are going to bet the flop, and they're not making it into this line. I wasn't too sure. I think I've looked at the sim, and I've looked at a couple of different sims, and in some cases betting small is reasonable. In other cases, which is what I did. So I looked at a couple of different sims here, and in some cases the checking is just the way to go. In some cases, if you give it a 10% bet, which is what I ended up doing, then this is sort of okay, but generally this is just slightly too weak to be betting, and we want to build a betting range around a queen or better here. So slight mistake, I would say, if I look at the different sims. My opponent ended up raising, and I just decided to go with the player profile that I had, and the player profile seemed on the more passive side rather than the more aggressive side, so I just go and block bet and then fold. It was definitely one of the tougher hands in the session, but I think it's fine. Like if you're in a node like this, going with a block bet and then deciding based on player profile is a reasonable strategy. There are like, if you go into equilibrium in the solve here, the villain should be finding most of his third pairs as a bluff here. I think at this level people are finding those bluffs generally, and so if I was playing versus a more neutral player, I would just click call and don't think about it too much. Here, this is an interesting one. I face a small c-bet. And in game, I thought that we were allowed to raise sometimes with the side card as a spade as well. But because villain is in early position and he has all of the suited aces become a reasonably large part of his range, you want to block those a bit more. And so solvers are check raising when they have the ace of spades with his combo, but not with the queen of spades. I think in general it is fine though. I try to be mindful of the fact that you need to find some hands that are bluffs on these textures, because people generally under check raise with single spades or even with just straight draws, and in some textures got shots on textures like this, on monotone textures like this. Alright, so here we get an open and we get a call. Villain 7 is a regular. He's just a short stacking regular. He covers the recreational, so I think he's just sort of playing a strategy like that, where he doesn't want to play deep versus the other racks. And we 100 big blinds deep, we could potentially squeeze this. When we're, what is it, like 26 big blinds deep, 27, becomes a bit awkward because I would be committing myself pretty much versus villain 7 unless I go very small, and then I could increase like the calling ranges quite a bit. So I just decided to call. It is a low frequency squeeze anyway, so this is fine. A small bet, and then we just get the fold here. Another interesting fold here. So I get an open by villain 7, villain 6 3 bets, and villain 1 the recreational cold calls, and villain 1 is playing 20 big blinds here roughly. And I decided that getting it in versus villain 1 is probably very profitable. So either going large or what I just did, jamming. Both options are reasonable, I think, with the amount of dead money involved. If we're going to jam this, then we might need to jam something like kings or queens at a reasonable frequency, but I think I would find those as well. So I think this is reasonable. You could just cut out the jamming option completely and just go with a large 3-bet, 4-bet, I should say. I think either way is fine. I just went with a jam here and we got a call. And this one stung a little bit because I'm usually playing 5, 10 and 10, 20. And suddenly when you're playing at the highest limit, some of you guys might recognize this feeling. Every, even mid-sized pot suddenly feels like it matters. Whereas if I would just go all in, this morning I played 1k and 2k, and if I lose an all in, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of weird how the brain works sometimes. We get a check here. This is a very interesting hand versus recreational. I actually reviewed this with the mentorship program. I was reviewing these hands earlier today with the guys in there. Shout out to them. And one of the guys came with a pretty cool line that we could take here. So I bet flop here, which is fine. You could check as well. Either way is reasonable. If you check, you're getting a bet too often on the turn, generally speaking. Although in limp pots, I'm not entirely sure if that works the same way. We can get some value now though. He's playing quite erratic, and so just betting, and he's playing quite passive. So he's kind of all over the place, but relatively not really betting or raising a lot. So I think just betting is reasonable. You could just check as well. I don't have a strong opinion on that. And then on the turn is where it gets interesting. I thought about betting a little bit and opted for a check. But I think in hindsight, I would want to bet because of the fact that we can get value from weaker hands quite a bit. There's a random 10x that is calling the flop. Ace highs are rarely going to be folding here if we bet half pot. Whereas draws, 5x is probably not folding. And I make life relatively easy. Can potentially value bet the river, although it would be very thin on some blanks, and mostly going to be checking back. And we have some additional equity, so that's always good. I went with the check though, and then we got into this line where we now face 3/4. And earlier in the session, we saw our opponent bet a flush for a costume sizing where he went like 80-90% pot. So when I faced this 3/4 bet, I kind of realized, okay, probably he's going to not have a straight as often, slightly discounting the amount of combinations there. But it's also relatively tough to find complete airballs, although he's a recreational, so I'm sure he'll have some. I thought it would be close with my hand, and all three options are on the table. And generally when that's the case, I think going with the most aggressive option generally yields the highest reward, because risk taking in poker generally gets rewarded. That's not necessarily the reason to do this. I think in this case it's just slightly higher EV. It's close though. I think like if I have a 10, then jamming becomes a lot better. Now I block some of the hands that villain is randomly betting here, like jack 8 or jack 7 that he might fold, and I could probably just call and win often enough versus random hands that my opponent might have. I jam, I get called, and he has a straight here. Like, the data is inconclusive here, meaning if a recreational bets half pot or less, then it's definitely overfolded. If they go 3/4, it becomes a bit closer, and they're not really overfolding. I thought it would be close either way. I think I'm pretty close to indifference between all three options here, and it's really hard to assess which one's best. So going all in, probably not a mistake, but yeah. This is an interesting one versus a regular. You can see he's a bit deeper. I'm still 100 big blinds down. I go from 2 big blinds to 2.2 to 12. So polar strategy, which means that I'm lacking pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket 8s, 7s here quite a bit, and I just have like more polarity in my range. So more of the higher pocket pairs, a lot of the offsuited stuff that my opponent doesn't really have, like ace king and ace queen, are going to make it in there. So I'm not really doing very well on this texture. And in game I decided I will just check my entire range. I looked at the sim, and the sim says bet 25-ish% of the times here. If you go smaller, you're allowed to bet more often, because now you have like a wider range, your opponent has a wider range, and you're going to have some more pocket 10s in particular, but mostly like your opponent has wider range now as well, and his range isn't as centered around like the middling part of his range. Now that we go polar, we go big, pre-flop, we need to be a bit more careful. So betting at a low frequency, checking your entire range is fine here. And that's what we do. And then we check. I thought for a few seconds and I came up with this line, which is a very good line, solver approved. Not that I'm necessarily going for solver approved lines, but in this case I think it's pretty cool. Ace 10 is either never raising or very seldomly raising. Jack 10 is just a fine raise and happens about 40% of the times, 30% of the time, something along those lines. And you just want to have that additional equity. You're allowed to barrel the turn quite a bit on a lot of blanks and like overcards as well. So just a spot where you can just get value now from weaker hands, deny some equity. You have equity yourself that you can still realize most of the times. If he jams, you're just more or less running your equity. You don't get 50% equity, but you don't need it then. So yeah, just a line that you should take, because otherwise the imposition player is just allowed to bet at a very high frequency. Here we open kings, and here I made a slight mistake. I don't think it's massive, but a slight mistake for sure. We get 2 checks here on this ace high texture, and I decided to bet quarter pot, slightly less actually. And the reasoning that I had in game was I kind of want to play a heads up versus player 1, and player 7 is just throwing away his trash now. Player 1 is just going all over the place and is sometimes calling me with random stuff. But if I check here, then villain 7 is inclined to play a very honest strategy, generally speaking, because he wants, like he has 2 streets. Let's say he has ace queen here. Then he's very incentivized to just bet 2 times versus villain 1 and just get most of, if not all of his stack. And I could just be folding versus like any sizable bet on the turn. And because villain 7 plays so honest and I don't really have a 3-street value hand anyway, I think I'm just more incentivized to check and sort of see what happens. To get 1 street closer to showdown, potentially get a bluff from either player, but specifically player 1. And then like from villain 7 we get a very honest response. This is a very cool hand versus recreational. So recreational limps I ISO on the wider side, but versus recreationals you want to ISO wide because you don't get an ISO 3-bet as often, and you get to play heads up in position with a skill advantage versus recreational. So only good things can happen. And then this happens, he donks 1/3 pot. And from the data we know that once they donk small here, they're going to overfold quite a bit versus raises. It is relatively close though. If I have king queen, I can just call, and my hand is sort of strong enough. I can see enough branches of the game tree where my king queen high either wins at showdown or spikes something, or you get a check and sometimes can turn it into a bluff or something like that later on. With king 9 it becomes a bit iffy, and I decided to just immediately raise to collect the overfold that I'm getting right now. I'm getting an overfold on the turn as well, if he calls, which ended up happening. And on the river, I get an overfold as well. So after, basically what ends up happening here is recreationals just randomly bet a range that contains a lot of air, but also sometimes like it's randomly pocket jacks here or pocket 10s or whatever. In that case, you get a jam here quite often. But like there's all sorts of stuff in there. If you ask me why is he betting like this, he probably doesn't know. If you ask him, like, he's not going to give you a cohesive answer. So I just play the data here. Data shows that they're overfolding, and so I'm just raising and then turn betting, and we get a fold here. For what it's worth, like I said, like I am playing the data, but I'm still playing poker. If I have ace king here or king queen, like I said, I'm just going to call because I think my equity is just good enough to justify calling. King 9 is a bit close. I just decided to, if it's close, you can see it generally take the more aggressive action. Especially versus recreational, I think that is going to be good. Here we ISO again. This time we get a limp fold. You get an interesting river bluff catching spot. And think for a second, make your own decision here. I ended up calling. And I was good. And my opponent bet a hand that he really shouldn't be betting. His check is winning quite a bit here. I estimate like, I don't know, like 35% of the times or something like that. In a limp pot, I think you're going to be winning quite often there. So you need to overcome that in order to be making a bluff profitable. Here we flop gin. It's just really tough to get value. Doesn't really make sense to check here, which is something that I see low stakes players do. For one, it's very face up. And unless your opponent is like blindly probing range or something like that, it doesn't really yield any additional EV because of the fact that if your opponent is a thinking player, then he realizes, okay, this is a range betting texture, why is he not range betting? That's one. Two, if he's a thinking player, then he realizes that on every turn, he should, in theory, be checking range, pretty much. Like last point is that we block 2 queens as well. So even if he's not checking range, then he is going to be checking range pretty much because of the removal that we have with our hand. If our opponent has like a pocket pair, he's going to be calling versus a small bet anyway. Pretty much all pocket pairs are calling here. No, all pocket pairs are calling here, not pretty much all pocket pairs. And so like if he is turning something, then he will turn something with his calling range as well. Like checking back here to letting him turn something doesn't really make sense. Let's just go with the range bet and we know that we're going to get a fold quite often. But yeah, we still do it anyway. Here we get a spot where we just get to bet our entire range. Again, now we get a check raise. And when we get the check raise here, I think it's important to note, especially if you're playing lower stakes, that it's relatively easy to overshoot the amount of king, queen, king X type of hands that you're allowed to check raise. King, queen is allowed to check raise 40% of the times, 35% of the times here, because it's such a good board for the in-position player, where I have a ton of aces, kings, ton of the higher cards, and villain 7 has, as the pre-flop caller, more of the lower cards. So definitely my board. Yet, like if you're playing low stakes, I could see the average rag thinking, hey, I flop trips, that's a really good hand, let me just go ahead and raise it. And like the majority of the kings should be calling here. Alright, so that's it. Those were the hands for this video. If you guys have any questions, drop them in the comments down below. And there's a link to our Discord server as well. I recently gave away a free coaching session in there, so I'm always around, happy to engage with any of you guys, so feel free to join that as well. For now, good luck at the tables if you're playing today, and take care.